This is a compilation video of Quickies that were once uploaded to my main channel. I moved them off there since they were cluttering the place up between my main videos. While I have divided each of them up based on anime season, there may be some things from other anime seasons mixed in there, as I may have watched things that were from a prior season during that one. You will find timestamps for each anime talked about in each of these compilations in the description. Thank you.
Anime finished this year number 1, Tamako Market, 7 out of 10. And here we have just a slice of wholesome goodness about a girl who really loves the shopping arcade that she's grown up in and her family's mochi shop. Tamako Market isn't wildly deep or anything like that, but it's a really nice time. It's just sweet and wholesome the whole way through, which has me looking forward to giving the movie a watch in just a bit. There's not much to say other than that I enjoyed it and it was pleasant, honestly. It's one of those shows that's just a vibe. What it does best is that it creates a space and then makes it feel lived in. I have never walked around the shopping arcade that Tamako lives in, but it feels like a place I could go to if I wanted, and God does it make me want to go there with how pleasant everyone is. There are only 2 flaws to this show in my eyes. One is a flaw that the show felt like it grew out of with time. The shop owners of the arcade do feel like they're a little too involved and a little too nice at first, but that feeling lessened as time went on, and it became clear just the way that Tamako is such a fixture in the shopping arcade and has been for her whole life. It was something that didn't seem to fit at first, but by the end of the series, I totally bought into their feelings. The other is that I don't think the whole Prince and Dara plot lines needed to exist at all. While I understand that we want the season to build up to some sort of big moment and all that, I just think that this plot never fully fit itself into the world of the show. Dara grew on me, but the talk of finding a bride for the prince never did, unfortunately. While it all resolved in a way that was satisfying enough, I suppose, I can't say that it was ever investing. I was more interested in finding a record of the song that Tamako's mother used to sing than this odd plotline. Anime finished this year number 2, Hanebado, 7 out of 10. So this wasn't what I was expecting when I went into the series. At first, this seemed like it would be your typical high school sports show, just with badminton and girls this time. From the outset, it seemed like the big drama was going to be that there was tension between a girl who didn't want to play the sport anymore and a girl who was hyperfixated on the time she lost to said girl who didn't want to play anymore. What I got instead was a little bit of that, but a whole lot more family melodrama. This is definitely one of those things where the sport is just a framework for a whole lot of drama to happen around. Sadly, a nice chunk of that drama is based in miscommunication and people not being able to talk about their feelings, but what else is new? That's kind of the standard for these sorts of sports and drama shows. What stood out early on to me is just how much these girls were willing to accept and succumb to their limits compared to other sports shows. A lot of the time, the genre is full of stories of working hard to overcome those limits, full of characters with boundless energy to get anything done. Here, however, there was a not insignificant amount of characters who were willing to go, I'm actually not that great at this, and I've reached my skill ceiling. There's also a higher than usual number of characters that are kind of psychotic. Like, some of these girls have just gone off the deep end when it comes to sports. This isn't trash talking, it is straight up feral, to the point that it's clearly detrimental to the people around them. And that's an angle that I actually found pretty fun, since it's not something we always see, especially with female-led sports series. Let the girls be feral. Anime finished this year number 3, Harukana Receive, 6 out of 10. I do love me a good old-fashioned found family sports anime, so when I found another volleyball anime after loving Haikyuu, you know I had to try this. Even better, it was on beach volleyball, the sport that doesn't get as much of the limelight compared to its bigger teamed cousin. Not to mention, it was going to focus on girls' sports and look to have decent production values, which can be something of a rarity, unfortunately. However, this one ended up being a decent mix of great and not so great stuff. I'll start with the not so great so we can end on the good. First of all, this is another one of those series that isn't a full and complete story. I understand that's just part of the fact that it's an adaptation of a source material that's too long for it all to fit into a 12-episode package. However, since my roommate and I tend to watch these sports series together, The both of us are getting a little tired of the end of the season being the team gearing up to head off to nationals, only for nationals to never be something that actually comes to pass, thanks to the point where the season has to cut off. It's such a trend in these shows, it's almost comical. Unfortunately, many of these shows never see a second season either, so that story is just left hanging there. The other issue is the way that the show has a lot of unneeded fan service shots. I am not complaining about the fact that these girls spend most of the series in bikinis. That's kind of standard for the sport after all. However, the show is full of shots from low angles to get a girl's ass in frame when it adds nothing to the story, which makes me keenly aware that this was made with a certain male viewership in mind. It was just done in a way that was distracting and annoying. We spent the first several episodes laughing about how the swimsuits had absolutely no level of support that would be needed for playing a highly active sport like volleyball. However, underneath those problems, this is a decently enjoyable sports anime with some nice found family elements that we always like to see in this sort of thing. The animation is well done, making the action of the sport feel fun and dynamic. Some of the characters are a little on the thin side, but even in those cases, they're still fun and likable. Matches are kept nice and snappy, not dragged out for the sake of filling time. Overall, it was fine, but not anything special though, and I don't feel the need to rewatch it anytime soon. Anime finished this year number 4, Wonder Egg Priority, 6 out of 10. I had seen warnings about how this one bungled the ending, but I thought it was only fair that I see for myself if that was the case or not. I had seen some animated clips floating around since it had come out, and I was curious to see it, if only for that animation, because goddamn were those colors that it was making use of really gorgeous. I was having a lot of fun with the series in the first few episodes. While it's perhaps a little gauche to make use of suicide and the personal traumas of teenage girls that were based in very real sorts of trauma to make monsters for your Monster of the Week adventure, it had so far been handled well, and there was a sort of power fantasy to overcoming those things with a big mace styled after a multicolor pen. The first part of episode 4 was really great. It kicked me in the chest for a moment there. However, episode 4 was the episode where the cracks first started to show as well, with some kind of gross gender essentialism coming in with the supposed reason that it was only teenage girls in the eggs. This made the episode with Kaoru a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, the show was fairly affirming of him being a trans man, just as it had been with Momoe's relationship to her gender, only characters who were outright disgusting villains being the ones to treat her as anything but a girl. However, the essentialism of episode 4, mixed with the fact that Kaoru was indeed inside an egg, made it feel like the show still viewed him as a girl despite affirming his transness. However, I say that all as a cis woman here, so maybe my read on this was a bit off. I would love to hear from some trans people on how they feel about that handling. The sudden shift from fantasy to sci-fi was jarring, and I can't say that I liked it. We had a fairly grounded world, but suddenly there are full AIs and robots not only as a possibility, but also happening well over a decade in flashback. To me, it just felt like a lack of faith in the audience to accept a fantasy concept without there being some sort of a reason behind it. Like the world had to be justified, despite the clear use of dreamscapes. Fantasy could have just been fantasy, and the show would have worked. Frill is the show's biggest sin. Two men who admit they don't understand women make a teenage girl and it goes poorly. Color me shocked. Frill being the root of the first girl's suicide made some level of possible narrative sense, but the idea that she's the root of most, if not all, suicides of teenage girls is patently ridiculous. I would be inclined to call Uraraka an unreliable narrator if there was anything in the show that actually challenged what he said. Instead, the show treats his word like the truth the whole way through. It's frustrating because this is a visually amazing show with wonderful character designs, great action, and beautiful color work. However, I'm going to have to settle for watching somewhat isolated chunks of it that I love because I can't possibly love the whole. Anime finished this year number 5, Aggretsuko, Season 5. 8 out of 10. Prior seasons range between a 6 and a 10 depending on the season. Aggretsuko has had fluctuating quality over the years, I won't deny it. While this season didn't reach the heights of my personal favorites, it also didn't dive into some of the lows either. Season 4 was my least favorite season personally, which had me worried for this finale, but I have to say I am at least satisfied with what we have been given here. The biggest problem with Season 5 is that it feels like it's split between two different stories, which is both to its benefit and its detriment. The benefit comes from the way that the season did some serious damage control in order to rehabilitate Haida after his character had been pretty demolished over the last season. Giving him some more focus early in the season and getting him to a place where he was not only growing up somewhat, but having to face reality himself was a good choice, and I was glad to see him more fully resolved, even if there are still some wrinkles to iron out as the season wraps up. However, this was also a detriment given the way that this is the finale season to Aggretsuko, and the title character's arc for the season doesn't start until we are a good handful of episodes in. While I don't mind that we went with the political storyline, and I think it was a natural direction for the series to go, given that each season had focused on varying cultural aspects, in the season itself, it felt like it sprang up out of nowhere. A little more of the seeds of that plot being spread in the Retsuko-focused parts of the Haida episodes could have smoothed this out somewhat. I think that the 10-episode limit also constrained the series a little. It would have benefited them to give the final episode or two some more breathing room so that the ending of the season didn't feel quite so rushed. Either way, the series didn't go out on the highest note, but it did go out on a pretty decent one that wrapped things up for the most part, and I think it stopped right in time to not overstay its welcome. Part of me will miss this a little, but I had a lot of fun with it while it was here. Anime finished this year number 6, The Fire Hunter, 6 out of 10. So the ending of this one surprised me, as in I wasn't expecting it to end when it did at only 10 episodes. Mostly because I didn't know what the episode count was meant to be, but also because it felt like the series was really starting to build towards what was going to be some level of a final act. However, it just cuts off right there, in the middle of what feels like some pretty big raising of the stakes and something of a turning point. As such, I'm not fully sure how to feel just yet. I'm glad the show is getting a second season, but I also wish that the ending of this season wasn't quite so abrupt. For me, a lot of the characters here fall a little flat aside from a small handful of standouts, but the world is really meant to be the star of the show here, so I'm not entirely surprised that I ended up feeling that way. However, at the same time, I do wish that I didn't. I would have liked to be a little more connected to them, but some of them can feel kind of flat at times, which does make it a little more difficult. Still, the world of the show is interesting, and it's always something of a slap to the face to remember that this takes place in a post-apocalypse during a second industrial revolution instead of during just, the first industrial revolution. It's not that that's a bad thing, but it is something that can feel like a background element until it's really, really not. The differing factions and the intrigue of the plot were more than enough to carry me through here, and I loved the lived-in feeling that the city had once we reached it. Even if the streets can look empty at times, so the crowded feel I think it was going for is a little lacking. I don't believe the novels have official translations at the moment, but I do hope they get one in the near future because I would love to give them a read. The downside is there was always this feeling that I had that this series had somewhat bitten off more than it could chew. It's definitely ambitious, but I think that ambition was somewhat of a downfall for the series as well. The art style of the series is fantastic, and I really did love the way it had a more grounded feel to it than I think some other productions might have gone for. I may not have agreed with every design choice that was made here, but you also can't say that it wasn't making some strong choices. The problem is that the animation of that art style could be pretty lacking at times. Because of the look that they went for, any CGI elements stood out like a sore thumb. Shots of the manor and any time Kun made use of stag beetles easily come to mind. There's also this usage of cut-in shots that didn't come up very often and can feel like a reason to not have to animate a full body or just parts of one instead. I think the still art pieces that are used at sometimes are very well done and the color work in them is fantastically beautiful, but they also felt somewhat weirdly placed at times and their usage was odd, as some episodes could have quite a few and others none at all. It leads to this feeling of inconsistency, like these things were used as something of a band-aid patch. That inconsistency is what really keeps them from feeling like a real stylistic choice. That's not even getting into the way that there would sometimes be very obvious animation errors, such as the time that a tree vanished, leaving a man who had been pinned to it very obviously floating in the air. And for a series that there were a decent amount of moments that were meant to be action, quite a few of those action beats could feel incredibly stiff and stilted. Watching the OP, there are some gorgeous cuts of action animation there that the show was never able to live up to, which was incredibly disappointing to see. I will be watching the second season that was announced the same day as the finale, to be clear, but I hope that the success that the series has seen can allow them to make changes to the production that will allow the next season to feel like it is more consistently put together, rather than the roughness that is present in the current existing one. I think tightening up those animation problems could make it easier to recommend. Anime finished this year number 7, The Ice Guy and His Cool Female Colleague, 7 out of 10. This is one of the shows from this season that I was actually looking forward to, since I needed myself a good old-fashioned workplace romance that didn't just feel like it was doing the same tropes as a high school romance with a new coat of paint. Something light and fluffy like that is exactly what I got, but sometimes we need a show like that. It even had some light supernatural elements that weren't at the forefront, but managed to make the world a little more interesting and gave room for some stronger character personalities to work their way into the mix. It is a series that I will freely admit took a little while to find its footing, though. The first few episodes are a little choppy, but over time this evens out and settles into a nice, relaxed pace. It thrives in that sort of pace, too, given that a lot of the moments that are the most intimate are quiet and subtle ones rather than big, showy ones. I like most of the characters, and even the ones that I am not attached to, I have to admit, have their place in proceedings and have their own charm. Personally, I really like the titular ice guy, Himuro. It was really nice to get a male lead that just wears his heart on his sleeve like he does, while allowing the female lead to be the more reserved one. But it also doesn't take her to extremes like something like Komi Can't Communicate does, or make her coolness something that makes her perfect either. She's just a little on the quiet and polite side, and that's okay. I can definitely see how some people might find this a little bland and vanilla, but it's something that managed to get a giggle out of me here and there and have me smiling more often than it didn't, so I have to say it's a pretty solid josei romance. One thing that really stood out to me on the animation side of things was the way that the characters' eyes would sometimes shake and dart around a little. This was just such an interesting touch of realism that we don't get very often, and I found myself really appreciating it. It gave such a nice light tension to those quiet moments between Himuro and Fuyutsuki. I've seen that some don't like it, and I can understand, given that it's a bit different than what they might be used to, but it was one of those little touches that really drew me into the series personally. Just be aware that this is a series that is on a nice, steady, slow burn. There's no big romantic resolution at the end of the season or anything like that. Perhaps in another season if we get one, or the manga. And while I love a slow burn, it can be a bit hard to watch a whole season if it doesn't end with at least a big step forward, even if there were a bunch of little ones along the way. Anime finished this year number 8, Kaina of the Great Snow Sea, 4 out of 10. If there was a word that I had to pick to describe this show, it would be either disappointing or underwhelming. You see, I'm not someone who gets annoyed by full CGI anime unless it's done incredibly poorly, and while this might not be the best example that I've ever seen, it's not like it was the worst either. When I watched the first episode or two, it had my interest. The world that it was trying to construct seemed interesting, and there was some clear Nausicaa inspiration that was happening in the world design, which I really appreciated. However, for all the ways that the world was interesting, the characters weren't. The world was a place that seemed serious, dangerous, and fascinating, but at times it could feel like the characters weren't rising to match that world. Most of the time they were just fairly bland, but at others they could delve into some real anime bullshit type of moments. Like, what was the point of having Ruiha's top fall down in the sauna? It was so out of keeping with the tone of the rest of the series, it felt like someone had broken into the studio and slipped a scene from a different show into this one. The biggest problem facing the series, though, was that the pacing was just plain bad. There were times where we could go entire episodes feeling like nothing was happening, only for a whole bunch to suddenly happen all at once before things slowed right back down again. It would be one thing if this were to allow us to breathe in the world and sit with the ambiance, but many episodes contained conversations that felt like they were repetitive, even if they technically weren't. I had my worries about the series ending in any way that felt satisfying when it was announced that a follow-up movie would continue the story, but I didn't expect the ending to be fumbled so badly. The war plotline was a story that the series didn't really need. The search for the Great Spire Tree could have made up the entire plot of the show, been more concise, and likely been a stronger adventure story. The war plotline was dragged out, though, only to end with a big Deus Ex Machina moment where, spoilers, a teeny tiny laser cutter turned into a massive energy beam that obliterates anything in its path and effectively ends the whole war plot. This is followed up by a montage to end the series and lead into the movie that flashes through moments that could have easily been 3 episodes on their own that were far more interesting than anything that had happened in the last 2. At this point, I don't know if I'll bother seeing the movie, to be honest. This is one of those series that burned me, and I can't be sure of what quality the movie will be after seeing the series vary so wildly in quality over the course of its run. Anime finished this year number 9, The Magical Revolution of the Reincarnated Princess and the Genius Young Lady, 7 out of 10. Let's get one thing out of the way. The reincarnated part of that title very much didn't need to be part of this series. It's such a sliver of the show that you only remember that it is an element when it is brought up a grand total of, I think, 2 times. It might have been a stronger series if that wasn't added in there for the sake of being there because light novel. Anyway, this was decent enough. Not a favorite of mine, and not one that I need to rewatch, but it's not like watching it was a bad time either. One of the things that stood out most to me was just how strong the character designs on this show were, which then leads into the fact that they were animated beautifully. It's a visual treat if you're interested in seeing some of the flashier magic sequences that a show this season has to offer. The only thing that I really have to knock about the visuals is the way that I think that Anisa's fights could have been handled differently. She's a character that is unable to do magic, and when she is using a tool, that is obvious, but there comes a point where she's basically had a magic tool tattooed into her body, and once that happens, her usage visually looks about the same as anyone else in the show who can use magic, which cuts down on that whole idea. I admit I wasn't too interested in most of the plot or the magic going on in it, though personally I think the fact that we didn't have more time spent delving deep into the magic system of this world from Anisa's more scientific perspective was something of a wasted opportunity. I can understand why some of the plot needs to happen, of course, but the demands of the plot did weigh the series down a little. The start is fine, and the very end, but the arcs in the middle of the season can feel like a little bit of a slog at times. The plot and magic weren't what I stuck around for, though. The whole season, I was just there for the relationship between Anise and Yuffie, because that really is the core of the show. The both of them are just so wonderful together, and they bounce off each other really nicely. I also like that their dynamic changes somewhat and evolves over the course of the season in relation to how their actions are reshaping the world around them. I was spoiled on how the season was going to ultimately end up, but honestly, the spoiler is more that things are fully confirmed by the end of the season, because there was some pretty strong subtext being laid in the early episodes. Anime finished this year number 10, Urusei Yatsura 2022, 5 out of 10. I suppose I should get it out of the way that while I have read, watched, and enjoyed many Rumiko Takahashi series over the years, Urusei Yatsura has never been one of my favorites. It's not that it's terrible or anything, but it was always one of hers that was least to my tastes. Still, as the series was being redone in a sort of greatest hits format, that seemed like a great format for someone like me, so I gave the new season a shot. However, it never completely grabbed me and ended up being something that I watched more for the absolutely gorgeous animation rather than any real interest in the characters or the gags that was happening. And that animation is absolutely gorgeous. The colors that were chosen in order to bring this world to life were perfect, and the movement of characters is wonderfully fluid unless the timing for a joke calls for them to be otherwise. Lum, in particular, always looks amazing, which is to be expected since she is the poster girl for the series. The jokes just never got any real amusement out of me, and I think part of that just comes down to the age of the series. This was a late 70s and early to mid 80s series that was genre defining at the time. The problem is that when something is genre defining, many things that follow will pull threads from the original cloth. There are just a lot of gag archetypes in here that I've seen many times over the years, and there's only so many times a joke is funny when you hear it. Don't get me wrong, the series is a classic for a reason, but there ends up being a lot here that I feel like I've seen before. I also can't think there was a character that I particularly liked, and I understand that part of the joke is that everyone kind of sucks and is an idiot, but when the comedy isn't working for me and neither are the characters, there's not really anything else for me to latch onto. If this is something that you enjoyed, I would love to hear about why. Like I said, this was one of the Takahashi pieces that I wasn't as hot on in the first place, so I'm not surprised that I didn't care too much for it, but I am super curious as to what other people enjoy about it. Anime finished this year number 11, Revenger, 6 out of 10. Revenger is a show where the whole point is to just kind of shove as many cool things as it can into 12 episodes, and if just seeing cool things is what you're looking for, I can't say that you'd be going wrong here. However, if you're looking for anything deeper, then I think you might want to find a different Swords and Sandals series. While there are a few interesting elements or characters, this series ends up being style over substance for the most part. Part of that comes down to the fact that there are a lot of characters, but many of them or their relationships to other characters are underbaked. The main character has a decent amount going on, and one character gets something of a backstory, but the other three that make up the main team of the series, I don't really feel like I ever got to know them on a deeper level than slacker with gambling problem who fights with Razor Hanafuda cards, or big muscle doctor who shoots a harpoon bow. There are some somewhat fun antagonists that come in near the end, but they're introduced so late in the game that I feel like I didn't have time to know them. This isn't helped by the way that the start of the series feels fairly episodic before tying back into plot elements of the first episode later on. Technically, the one-off episodes are relevant, but in a way that feels like the story was made to fit them into the later plot, rather than that plot emerging from those episodic episodes naturally. In the end, I watched this series every week, but it was never one that stuck with me. It was like, by the day after the episode had aired, I had forgotten everything that happened in it, which is a shame. If you're a fan of Gen Urobuchi's work, you're either going to love it or hate it. It's got a lot of his hallmarks and fingerprints on it, but having heard that this was something written a while back that's been sitting around until now, that shows. It feels unpolished and less complex than some of his later stuff. Anime finished this year number 12, Sugar Apple Fairy Tale, 9 out of 10. This was one that I really enjoyed. It was nice to get an anime fantasy series where things weren't all about going on some great quest to defeat some so-and-so, but instead exploring a profession in that world, the triumphs and the challenges of it, and how those are navigated. Anne is a great lead. It's clear that she still has a little growing up to do, but what's wonderful is the way that she's willing to listen and learn. She's stubborn, but in a way that's about getting things done rather than being unwilling to sit down and listen when someone is trying to show her something. It can feel a little bit like the whole world is cruelly against her for no reason, which I can understand that some people might find annoying. But given that this is a series broken into smaller arcs, I can understand that that is a way to generate conflict for the story, since it's not like this girl is going to go out of her way to deliberately make enemies. If there is one thing that I'm not super pleased with, it's the whole slavery element. I'll admit that this one does it better than most by actually setting the main fairy slave characters free, but there's also some yuckiness about the series pulling the typical bad boy romance tropes with the character of Chal, while he's still, at the time, actively enslaved. I don't think it would have been horrible to hold off on that a little while longer, just to avoid muddying the waters. However, that doesn't mean there's no commentary on this element in the world of the story, and we see the effects clearer than most in the genre. We see the way that another character basically fetishizes the idea of having Shao serve her just because he happens to be a good-looking fairy, and the way she takes advantage of the fact that he's lower than her in society, despite the fact that he is freed. When Anne purchases Shao at the start of the series, the first episode does actually throw her hypocrisy of buying a slave for protection back in her face, despite her being against the slave trade. Like I said, this is doing more with the idea than a series like this usually does, but the execution is somewhat soured by the fact that Shell is intended to be the main love interest for the series, and the way the two met makes for a slimy base to build from. The show also ends on a somewhat sour note overall, with characters left in horrible positions that are frankly a little upsetting. I would be more upset with this, but a second core was announced for this summer, so it's not like this is going to be where the anime leaves off forever. I have been reading the novels for this series and greatly recommend them if you're a light novel reader. They're engagingly written and short enough to be a nice, breezy read. So far, only the first two are out officially, with the third coming out next month, but the show so far has only covered the first 3 novels. There's not a whole lot that was cut, but they're definitely worth reading for the internal thoughts of the characters. You're just gonna have to get over the difference in spelling of Shall's name, as the book translation spells it Challe, while the subtitles went with Shall. Anime finished this year number 13, Endo and Kobayashi Live, the latest on tsundere villainess Lisalat, 8 out of 10. The only major problem that I could complain about when it comes to this one is the way that it requires you to have a certain level of understanding and genre awareness of the tropes of both otome games and the villainess light novel subgenre. For those who do have an understanding of those and enjoy them, though, this is quite the fun ride. What I appreciated the most is that while some of the characters found within the world of the game that Endo and Kobayashi are playing and influencing are something of stock characters, mostly the very small side ones, not everyone is. There are quite a few that are able to go beyond just being a stock archetype. For example, the titular Lisalet could have been characterized as being a tsundere just because. Yet the series isn't content to sit with just that. Instead, it delves into why she turned out that way and the thought processes that keep her behaving the way that she does. It's also just fun that the villain in the final episode is basically throwing a childish tantrum, and the characters mostly treat it like that. It's not treated as being anything more than what it is. And frankly, the series is just a lot of fun. There's some solid jokes in there that look at an otome game that feels like it's more from a place of love than some other series do. It's a series that you can tell the original author has some level of fondness for these games and for villainous characters in particular. It's definitely not perfect, though. There are some great animated moments, but on the whole, it can be inconsistent at times and has more than its fair share of wonky frames. It's definitely being carried more by its story and characters, but both of those are so charming that it definitely makes up for it. Anime finished this year number 14, Giant Beast of Ars, 3 out of 10. Yet again, a series this season that started out pretty strong, only to kind of lose where it was going after the first few episodes. I wanted to like this one, but it's a case where the little problems started to pile up over time. My first red flag was with the way that Kumi seemed to lack any sort of real agency as a main character. Not only was it set up that her role in a fight was simply to be absorbed into someone else because clerics like her were supposedly incapable of controlling their power on their own, but in a moment that she clearly had some sense that something was wrong, she didn't do anything, staying where she was until she was tricked into going. It never felt like she was really making her own choices and was just being shepherded around by others. That didn't change much, and when she did finally make her own big choice, it was to do something that would lead her, supposedly, to have a tragically young death. Then, in the end, she's able to pull some out-of-nowhere stuff in the realm of a fix-everything button, and it all feels incredibly messy and rushed. Messy and rushed is how I feel about a lot of this series, if I'm being honest. It was never able to make me really believe in or feel immersed in the world that it tried to create, and the civilizations in that world were intensely disconnected, to the point where going to a different place felt like the characters were stepping into a bunch of disparate shows. I just don't think that 12 episodes was enough to make all this work. Evidently, the staff behind the show didn't either, since the show just stops. One momentary threat is dealt with, only for the show to suddenly cut off when another bigger one arrives immediately after. I'll give them this, it's one hell of a Hail Mary for another season, that's for sure. It honestly ends up feeling like this is all the prologue for some sort of mobile game that doesn't exist. I was going back and forth with how to rate this, but settled where I did because the back half is just a mess, and the series as a whole just sort of nosedived what potential it had. I would give it props for the silly comedy relief species actually being the puppet masters for everything, but for no reason the series felt the need to end that plotline by turning one of them from child size into a hot lady in the final episode, which just felt really cheap. Anime finished this year number 15, My Hero Academia Season 6, 7 out of 10. Prior seasons range between 8 and 6 out of 10, Season 5 being a 6. This season was certainly more engaging than the last, I have to give it that. While I might not have been on board with everything that happened this season, it at least kept up a decent pace aside from maybe one or two spots that felt like something of a lull along the way. It also left off in a nice solid point in the story to give room to jump off of for next season. My major problems come down to basically one thing when it comes to this portion of MHA, and that's the fact that even when I read the manga, this was a part of the story where it just felt like the stakes get too inflated and do so too quickly. It's a problem that I have with the source manga too, so it's not like I can entirely fault the anime for this either. I just think for a series that was on a steady increase of things getting more out of hand, the sudden jump that happens over the course of this season is just a bit much. I've seen some people be disappointed with the visuals this season, and while I can understand that there were certainly some panels in the manga where the heavy detail put into them was what really sold them and made it feel impactful, I think you were also setting yourself up for disappointment if you thought it was going to be a one-to-one translation. Different mediums have different needs and different strengths. It's not always feasible to perfectly capture what made a source material special. The anime makes up for that in other ways, such as the addition of voice work and music. Honestly, there are a lot of moments in this season that are very much carried by the music here. There are parts that didn't hit me terribly hard when I was reading them, but felt more impactful in the show thanks to the soundtrack underscoring them. Whoever wrote that dramatic music theme that the series likes to reuse a lot deserves the fattest of paychecks for their service. Anime finished this year 16, saving 80,000 gold in another world for my retirement. 4 out of 10. Okay, so this show was really hit or miss for me, with it missing more and more the longer the series went on. While I understand what the joke of the show was, and I can understand how some people might end up liking it, I just think it ended up not being for me. There was an interesting idea or two here, but this isn't what I am looking for out of an isekai series. The main irk that I had with this series was the way that actions didn't feel like they had consequences. There was certainly a lot of cause and effect in the series, to be clear, but for all the times that Mitsuha slipped up or did something that was so obviously off base for the world, I got pretty sick of it being something to be laughed off instead of there being any actual sort of suspicion there. Like I said, I understand that the whole point here is doing that, but I much prefer the ascendance of a bookworm sort of approach to these sort of stories where protagonists are trying to make their fortune. The ones where we have to see them be smart about it and careful with what they do. Mitsuha is a fun protagonist, and the way she ends up being able to jump between worlds is an interesting concept for this sort of story, but I also wasn't able to get behind her at all. For one, the weird thing where she imagined her brother's advice was something that never sat very well with me. It was one of those elements that I would start to get comfortable that it had faded out, only for it to come back full force. While I understand that it's all in Mitsuha's head, having that be filtered through the image of her brother made those moments of insight feel less like they were coming from her, and made her come off as less clever as a result. And, okay, I know this might be a little contentious, but stay with me here. A lot of isekai have this to some extent, but this was the one where the colonialism/imperialism aspect really ended up standing out to me. It's not something that I think is intentional, as a lot of these writers are just trying to have a laugh, but this had some of the strongest bringing civility to the underdeveloped savages vibes of isekai that I've seen lately. It feels gross, especially once she's teleporting a small mercenary army into the world as well. While I can see someone really liking the last few episodes where Mitsuha basically goes screw it and starts using her powers left and right with even more reckless abandon than usual, it was really the nail in the coffin for me that I wasn't going to enjoy the series anymore. But I was so close to the end, I figured I might as well see it through. If you liked it, I'm happy for you, but personally wasn't for me. However, if it was something you enjoyed, I would love to actually hear about why. Anime finished this year number 17, High Card, 4 out of 10. So this is going to end up as a mobile game, right? This really feels like it's the basis for a mobile game. Either way, High Card is a very flashy show, a show that wants to be sure you know just how cool it is. There's nothing wrong with that, but it ends up feeling a little bit like it's trying too hard as a result. There's no denying that there is some level of inspiration being pulled from the Kingsman franchise here, but Kingsman had more wit to it, which is why I think it works there, but feels a little forced in High Card. The big problem with High Card, though, is that nothing about it feels resolved after having gone through all the episodes. Sure, it's set up a world, but it doesn't feel like that world was utilized to the fullest, and it feels like it was just meant to lay the groundwork for something bigger. Between that and the number of cards, yeah, it's got gacha game written all over it. What's worse, though, is that it wasn't even completely competent with what it did try to do aside from that. I adore the found family trope, but they tried to use that here and failed miserably. Our main character, Finn, has a moment late in the series where he's talking to another character about how much of a family everyone is, and I just couldn't believe it. These two characters had spent a decent amount of time together, sure, but the rest weren't around enough for me to even see them as being friends, let alone family. It ended up feeling hollow as a result. Then there's the way that what is supposed to be a big moment at the end of the series where the characters are making big moves that put them at odds with each other and both changes relationships and puts some in peril just didn't have any consequences afterwards. Everything resolves too easily and clearly for it to feel like there is any impact left by the events of the finale, so I have a hard time caring. It was also a disappointment to see that the one female character on the team was given the obligatory, it can make you turn into an insane sadist power. I know this power is something of a trope in anime, but it's one of those things that rubs me the wrong way when it's given to the only female character on our main team. It gives off this message of women being unable to handle things like the men can, which is kind of gross. That she's not given any arc outside of this only makes it more obvious. I'm not saying that this was intentional at all, but it's one of those things that has some unfortunate implications that I don't know if the writers fully thought through. I know that another core was announced around the end of the season, and while it's good to hear that this one is going to get some more expansion, I'm torn on if I'm going to end up watching it after this one didn't really feel like it was using the tools that it had at its disposal properly. It's another one from the winter season that was very much style over substance. Anime finished this year number 18, Campfire Cooking in Another World with My Absurd Skill, 6 out of 10. Once again, a rare isekai has managed to capture my interest. Yay! However, that doesn't mean I think this was the greatest thing in the world either. This is on the middle to low of series that I liked enough to stick with them through the whole season, and while I never considered dropping it, there were some episodes that I found to be a chore. Mostly whenever it came to characters actually trying to handle some of the more regular fantasy stuff like dungeons and all that, these episodes were simply bland and boring without much to offer that was unique to the genre. It was a portion of the series that really felt like it was being done more out of obligation rather than actually having something interesting to do with the story. The series is at its best when it's just chilling out and cooking. The cooking segments are relaxing, and this was one of the series that I was just unable to watch on an empty stomach most of the time, though nothing I ate during it really lived up to how good the food on my screen looked. If the series just more fully embraced this and was a chill slice of life instead of feeling the need to keep bringing up adventuring and the guild and all, I feel like I would have had a better time.
It's always disappointing to have a character who keeps saying that they're not going to do the whole adventuring thing and then just ends up doing it anyway. It feels more obligatory than anything else. I was worried early on that I wouldn't like the characters all that much, but I have to admit that the main trio that we spend most of our time with really grew on me the longer I watched. I think Sui is the first time that an isekai doing the cute slime gimmick actually worked for me and was genuinely cute and fun. While I am not a fan of the way that Fell essentially just hands power and riches to the main character outright all the time, the way that he exists as something of a demanding foodie of a companion is entertaining enough to have me wanting him to stick around. This is a show that can feel like it's meandering, but I'm not entirely upset by that, as it's clearly going for a more chill and relaxed vibe. Just moving through the world and stopping and cooking along the way is enough to sustain it for these 12 episodes. However, if this is going to have more seasons, I am going to need that world to actually get a little more interesting than generic fantasy towns and forests. Honestly, the fact that so much of this show is spent in stat screens and such sours it somewhat for me. Anime finished this year number 19, Buddy Daddies, 8 out of 10. I can totally see why people looked at this one and dubbed it, "We Have Spy Family at Home." However, I think that this show does enough to differentiate itself and stand on its own. One thing this one does really well is the whole idea of found family. By the time the season comes to an end, you really feel like these three have become a family and care about each other. That's something that's surprisingly hard for a series to pull off. Some of this might be played for comedy and a bit over the top, but it undeniably works here. I care about these people getting to stay together. It also does color work really well, the series feeling bright and poppy for most of the runtime until those moments where it doesn't need to be, where the palette takes on an appropriate tone to those situations. Overall, it's a wonderfully beautiful show. Even the comedy is accented by that, with the comedic expressions that the animators threw in really bringing some scenes over the top. However, I'm not so happy to report that there were a few small elements that hold this back from reaching some of the highest accolades that it could. For one, the handling of Miri's mother in the back half of the series really rubs me the wrong way. I don't have much of a problem with her changing her mind from where she was at the start of the series, since she was clearly in a bad place then. However, the way she's handled in the second to last episode felt like it was just for cheap shock value rather than actually adding anything to the story. And given that she's one of only 2 adult women given any prominence in the show, it's disappointing to see her treated in that way. Miri is cute, but she's also a little annoying, which is a bit of a problem. There are times where I really love her and times where I wish she would just zip it. Sure, that's the way real kids are, and I like that she's not some perfect little radiant sunshine perfect child, but there are some edges that could have been smoothed down. And finally, while the last episode mostly sticks the landing and wraps everything up in a satisfying way, the way it wraps up does feel like it comes about just a touch too easily. It's something that, given everything we've been told, I don't think that the leads should have been able to resolve so neatly without ongoing problems for them. It's just a case where it likely could have used one more episode of breathing room, which we might have gotten if it were not for the recap episode partway through the season. Anime finished this year number 20. Tomo-Chan is a Girl. 6 out of 10. This is one that I'm pretty torn on, if I'm being honest. There is a decent amount here to love. However, there is also a lot of places where things are just kind of muddied overall. I wish I could say that I unequivocally love this one, but that's just not true. For the good, I did end up liking most of the characters. High school rom-coms have this kind of bad habit of making side characters take center stage without being interesting sometimes. But here, I was finding myself often more interested in the side characters than the leads since they were so fun. I think anyone who has watched the show can say that Carol is the obvious standout as the most fun side character, but Misuzu is also pretty damn great too. The pair also have a great dynamic together in that golden retriever friend with black cat friend energy. I want to say that I like the romance here since there are moments that I find really sweet and cute, but the way that both Tomo and June are often both in that place of being unable to do anything from sheer force of being flustered is something that went from cute to annoying over the course of the season. It's a joke that wears thin when it gets in the way of actual development. I'm also not a fan of the fan service that is thrown around early in the series in regards to Tomo. The way the show can often fixate on the idea of her body being the only feminine thing about her feels gross. It's something that didn't need to be part of this otherwise wholesome and relaxed series. There's also the way the series shifts in the back third that feels somewhat unnatural. While it is nice to see the show actually acknowledge that Misuzu's comments about Toma needing to be more feminine were the problem, and we see her grow out of that mindset, there was also so much of that at the start of the series that was played both straight and for comedy, so it feels off. It's something of a tone shift, and I have to wonder if either there was some important manga content cut out, or if the author pivoted very suddenly on this. And finally, I don't think the last episode is very good. There is some good in there, but half the episode is taken up by this fight plot line that I can't get invested in. The characters all seem to be aware of just how stupid this is, but end up going through with it and taking it seriously anyway, which is just frustrating. The show tries to justify it in the moment, but it feels sloppy and more like the author felt there needed to be some kind of climax to the story instead of just letting the happy couple walk off into the sunset together. Problem is, that climax doesn't feel impactful when the conflict was introduced only about 10 minutes ago. Anime finished this year number 21. Ippon again, 6 out of 10. I'm sad to say that this is yet another show to fall to the girls' sports anime curse. Unless the show is aimed at a certain audience who expect certain things, the animation isn't going to be the strongest thing in the world. I thought this one might avoid it from the first episode, but the quality dipped in the second and wasn't the most consistent thing after that. I do applaud it, though, for giving the girls of the show varying body types. Many of these girls are stocky, chubby, or simply built, which I loved seeing. This is one of those shows where the charm of the cast is what's going to carry you through most of it. The cast is really likable, and they have some really relatable things they go through. The problem with that, though, is that for most of these characters, their major arcs are pretty wrapped up by the time we reach the tournament that takes up the back portion of the season. Once we get there, there's only like 2 that feel like they have arcs with substance and weight to them, which makes the back half of the series feel a little thin unless you're really invested in the judo action. That's another downfall the series has. It's really hard to get super invested in the judo competition side of things unless you're someone who already has some level of knowledge of judo. I knew little to nothing going in, and I feel like the only thing I learned was what an Ippon is, and even then, I'm not entirely sure if the definition I could give would be accurate. This isn't a series that is making any effort to lay things out for those of us outside the sport, even though there is a character in the series who is a newcomer to it, which would give reason for explanation. Now, if that's what the series does and it wants to be for the more hardcore enthusiasts, that's perfectly fine. However, I think those hardcore enthusiasts would be let down by the liberal use of panning or near still shots in the judo segments. It's a case where it's hard to recommend to judo fans because the series lacks the little details in the animation, but it's also hard to recommend to someone who doesn't know the sport since the show is just going to throw out terms and for the most part expect you to keep up. It's really in a no-win situation for finding an audience, unfortunately. Anime finished this year number 22, Blue Lock, 7 out of 10. Blue Lock is, in a word, ridiculous. It's over the top and takes things way more seriously than it needs to. The metaphors it uses to get across the ideas of advancement and blockages in sports ability are corny, and every time a character has an internal monologue, it's so faux edgy that I can't take it seriously. And yet, it's also so much fun. Blue Lock does something that I love in that it takes the concept of a death game, removes the death, and applies it to something else. A game of slow elimination until only one remains is something that is just satisfying to watch after all. There are times where it feels like Blue Lock is taking things a little too seriously, but then one of the characters will do something that's just absolutely unexpected and it'll have my attention again. I have to admit that there are only a few characters I actually like, though, either because they are fun or they feel the most
for lack of a better word, human compared to the others. There are a lot of characters in this series that are just there to be a gimmick character with some weird quirk that makes them entertaining for a little while. It can be hard to get invested in these characters, and a few of them can even become grating when they stick around too long. It also grows a little off-putting to have the main character have these big internal monologues that are full of intense language and such, and then the second he's not on the field, he's just a guy. The contrast feels jarring in a somewhat unpleasant way. The only other major issue that the show has is that it's visually inconsistent. There are often scenes where the action is animated in a way that has both insane visual appeal and a really great sense of impact. The usage of the change in characters' eyes to tell you where their head is at the moment was nice too. However, it can feel a little hamstrung by the times that CGI models are used. I don't begrudge the series for doing this, and the usage is usually very brief and unobtrusive, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it, especially when realizing the CGI models run very differently than the hand-animated cast.